Welcome to week 13 of HI2009, and this week I'm drawing the subject to a conclusion. I always find my own conclusions somewhat surprising as I'm in the process of drawing them, and that's because conclusions are more than a summary of what you've done. They need to be an explanation of what is important about the work you've done and a drawing together of what's significant and interesting about it. And yes, that is a tip for your essay. And an additional essay tip, as this is a conclusion, I'm not introducing any new material. I'm using slides that you've already seen and referring to evidence we have already examined within this subject. I would say there's nothing new here, but that's not true of a conclusion. There are just no new facts. There should be new insights on offer, and I'm hoping that that's what I'll do, that I'll draw together the subject for you, and that I'll help you make sense of it as you move on in your studies and in your lives. But before concluding the subject we've worked our way through, I want to draw your attention to the material I have chosen not to include. I've made my own way, supported by a variety of written sources and subject outlines from other institutions. And again, here's an essay tip. Historians need to be aware of the work of others and how it can be put to work in their own projects. Anyway, I've made my own way, supported by these sources, through a consideration of war and Australian society. That path is unique to this subject, and it reflects our present and the significance of war in it. In particular, outside your own independent work, this subject has not lingered on battlefields. We have not assessed strategy nor tactics. We have not examined the progress of any conflicts as they were fought. Time constraints have forced us to remain focused on the intersection between war and Australian society. And here's how this subject has played out. In considering war, I started by trying to define it. It's worth returning to that definition now that we have had the content of the subject to work with. And what I suggested back at the start of the subject was that we should recognise war as a familiar and legitimate tool of statecraft. Our definition reflected that war needed to involve recognisable political entities, and that while war was defined as involving violence, it was a particular form of violence controlled by states and used to try and achieve an end by coercion of others. I find that idea uncomfortable, but also difficult to dispute. War is legitimate and a tool available for use by states. And as a tool, it is often used by states as much to shore up alliances as to achieve directly beneficial outcomes for their citizens. It is also bounded by agreed rules, and those rules try and define what constitute legitimate targets and what and who are considered to fall outside war. And that raises an idea that has run through this subject. What is the relationship between soldiers and society? Within their lives, people can move between the categories of illegitimate and legitimate targets of war, and conscription and the advent of total war make the boundary between civilian society and military even murkier, as do usual human relationships. Are soldiers members of the Australian society the title promises to examine? Alternatively, is soldiering the test of citizenship? It's a thorny question, and one that I don't think we've managed to resolve. And in exploring it, we started the subject in Australia's colonial period. Discussion of the wars that occurred between traditional owners and settler colonialists is more contentious in Australia than within other settler societies, although frontier wars remain a difficult subject for historians and survivors everywhere. And in Australia, the argument about whether the history that occurred can be termed a history of war is actively debated. The Australian frontier wars demonstrate the ways in which definitions about tools of statecraft become problematic when applied to real people and their communities. And in Australia, the tools and techniques of war bled over into illegal activities, including, but not limited to, massacre. The language used to discuss different approaches to this history, massacre, police action, invasion, war, reflect different views of what constituted Australian society in this period, who belonged in the place being fought over, the level of violence that was experienced, and who was responsible for that violence. As a result, this week opened up another key theme in the subject, which is the commemoration of war. We can see those discussions about quite what occurred in Australia being played out in discussions and disputes about how to remember and commemorate the people and events of colonial Australia. Statues of colonial figures are contentious. Week 3 took us beyond the Australian continent and looked at the engagement of the Australian colonies and then Federated Australia with wars overseas. Here, war as a tool of statecraft came to the fore, although we grappled with issues of links between these wars and Australian society. In this colonial period, populations were mobile, and soldiers in particular moved between different sites of conflict. Can we claim the volunteers who left New South Wales and other Australian colonies to fight overseas as Australian? What does the enthusiasm of the Australian colonies for participation in the wider British world mean for Australian identity? And how should we remember these conflicts as Australia's earliest experiences of entanglement on behalf of its allies, as a sign that British rather than Australian society was present on the continent, or as an example of the ways in which states, even colonies, invested in training and preparedness for war and in opportunities to create extended alliances? In weeks 4 and 5, we came to the war which has the largest place in Australian commemorative infrastructure, the First World War. This war provided an excellent theatre to examine the themes within the subject. War as a tool of statecraft and Australia's involvement in wars which have not been fought on the Australian continent. War and commemoration, particularly the emphasis placed on Gallipoli when it was not exclusively an Anzac affair and when more Australians died elsewhere. War and the home front, which was an essential source of logistical support, emotional support, and a site for various types of suffering. War and citizenship, which came to the forefront in the debates around the conscription referenda, as well as in the internment of some Australian residents and their forced repatriation at the end of the war. While consideration of the suffering of soldiers caught up in the First World War is, I hope, something you have already encountered, I hope dealing with these larger themes in the context of this war was new. In particular, the conscription debates provide an extraordinary opportunity to examine how Australians saw the connection between nation, masculinity, and military service. But after 2 weeks, we had to move on. It would be possible to devote an entire subject to Australia's involvement in the First World War, but this is a broad survey subject. We moved from the First World War to the Second, and we used it as an opportunity to critique the notion of Australian society and recognise different experiences of war, not only among soldiers deployed to different theatres, but also among Australian civilians located in different regions of the continent. In week 9, we would return to the significance of gender on the experience of war. In week 6, we recognised the importance of location and race. The war in the Pacific reached Australia. In particular, it reached people in New Guinea, who were in regions at that time administered by Australia. It reached people in the Torres Strait, also a region administered as an Australian colony, and it reached Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia. Representation of these groups of Australian people in our histories of the war is variable, as is recognition of the impact of the war on the peoples and environments of Northern Queensland. In this subject, we had an opportunity to consider the different groups that constitute Australian society in our region and the different experiences of war in Northern Australia. In weeks 7 and 8, we examined the period known as the Cold War. We had a guest appearance from the world expert on nuclear testing in Australia, and again we considered the long reach of war into Australia and Australian society. Recognising the Cold War as a single conflict pushes our definition of war beyond its limits, yet it is something that is generally accepted by historians. And the period of the Cold War allowed us to examine those key questions within the subject in a different historical context. Again, we looked at war and citizenship, with opportunities provided both in Liz's work, which highlighted the expendability of some portions of Australian society, and the emergence of national service as a recruitment tool for the Vietnam War. We looked at war, memory, and commemoration, considering the ways that soldiers serving in the Korean War perceived themselves as immediately forgotten, the way that Vietnam veterans felt alienated from the society that sent them to war, and recognising that at the time, opposition to the Vietnam War was actually a minority position within Australian society. And we looked at war as a tool of statecraft, with Australia participating in larger conflicts as a testing ground for weapons it would never come to own, and choosing to send troops to foreign wars to show support for its allies when it was not facing immediate threat. In week 9, we looked at war and gender, and I was impressed with how well the topic was handled in tutorial. Looking at war through a lens of gender allowed us to pick up a variety of impacts of war on Australian society. We recognised that Australia had been a site of fighting during the colonial period, and considered the significance of the front line to experiences of war of both soldiers and civilians. We picked up on the many impacts of war for those caught up in it, including the experiences of civilian internees. Here is perhaps an absence in this subject. We examined the role of civilian internees in some detail, but not that of prisoners of war. And perhaps that is reflective of the difficult relationship between soldiering and citizenship. These were distinct groups, and their treatment was governed by different conventions. We also dealt with the issue of whose service the state would accept, and military service as a recognition of full participation in the life of the nation. This has been significant for a variety of Australians, most obviously women who have only recently been accepted as fully capable of military service, and also for queer men. And week 9 marked the start of the subject drawing together material from across our study of war and Australian society. In week 10, we entered the grey zone, and Hallam gave us a guest lecture on the role of surveillance during active war and of Australia's role in peacetime surveillance. I engaged with the question of how modern Australia recognises service during limited war, and the gap that veteran military thinkers have identified between the military and civilian society in Australia. And we also discussed whether we can consider attempts at coercion that might not be immediately visible and might not include physical violence as war. In doing so, we picked up on themes in the subject, but we tweaked them a little bit. We picked up on recognition, perhaps, rather than memorialisation of war, although the two are closely related. And we certainly picked up on that relationship between war and citizenship. And we extended that analysis because grey zone conflicts extend beyond clear battlefields and include civilian spaces. In week 11, I went full environmental historian and looked at the relationship between war and the environment. Again, it would be possible to teach an entire subject on this topic, and it is highly relevant to those of us who live in northern Queensland. In terms of the key themes in the subject, looking for the impacts of war on our local environment reveals just how far war reaches into the experiences of Australian society. And week 12, with a guest lecture from Alison Craven, also revealed the long reach of war into a sense of Australianness and representations of Australia on screen. Both Alison and the assigned reading recognise the significance of cinema in shaping collective memory and public discourse, and so brought in the theme of memorialisation and collective memory that has run through this subject. And that leads us to week 13. We have looked more at Australian society than at war, but we have recognised a wide range of conflicts and used them to inform our analysis. And I've been happy with the themes that have been picked up in this subject and that we've explored and I think thought about in useful ways. Those themes of war and statecraft, of war, memory and public discourse, including some consideration of the cost of maintaining commemorative infrastructure, and in particular the relationship between war and citizenship. This is a thorny issue that has delved into whether military service is a necessary component of citizenship, or whether it places service personnel in a category apart from civilian society and restricts their participation in that society. Accounts from war theorists who are themselves veterans suggest that the connections between war and Australian society are becoming less recognisable, and that is something that I hope this subject has, in its own small way, served to change.